Welcome back to the channel, folks, and to another Team Yankee painting tutorial, and this time the subject is the T64BV. I'm not showing you the airbrushing of the kit because that is fairly standard. It's a fairly monotone tank. The colours I used were Camo olive green and a touch of green grey with a bit of a highlight sprayed on with just some extra green grey in it, but there's not too much to see there, folks. It's just covering the whole vehicle. The main feature of this vehicle is going to be the explosive reactive panels and the weathering, so that's what I'm going to focus on today. If you want to see how I paint the tracks, the wheels, the running gear, lower hulls and such likes, I do have a dedicated playlist which covers all the vehicle essentials as I describe it, which includes washes, which you're going to see here, but it includes washes, lower hulls, tracks, wheels, chipping and all those kind of things as a separate playlist. But let's focus on the T64 just now. After I airbrushed the base colours, I applied a coat of gloss varnish. Now, this is not a big thick heavy coat, folks. The more varnish you apply, especially gloss, the darker the kit will become. The base colours will change. It really acts like a filter. So it's just a quick overspray to allow the wash to flow smoothly. I'm applying the wash as a pin wash, which you may or may not be familiar with, but hopefully you can see from what I'm doing here. A pin wash is touching the wash to the features, recesses, panel lines of the vehicle and letting the capillary action flow the paint around the feature. It's a very neat and tidy way that allows you to preserve the surface of the rest of the kit and prevents it from becoming too dark, and also from changing colour, because the wash will do that if you apply it all over. Enamel pin washes are the most common wash that you will see for this purpose, and it's one that I've used myself exclusively in the past, but I always wished that there was an effective acrylic version, because working with enamels, it's time consuming. It takes a long time for it to dry, for instance, and there's all the fumes from the thinner. Even if you're using odourless thinner, you're still using a thinner, which is not as comfortable as using an acrylic water-based paint. And when you consider that I can wash up to maybe 15 to 20 tanks in a day, working with enamels all day is a non-starter. So when Mig Ammo brought out this wash, I was sold straight away. You can hopefully see how easy it is for me to use and how little cleanup I'm having to do. It's just going where I want it to go. I can use it thicker or thinner depending on the needs of that particular part of the figure, and just thin it with some water. I work off a palette and it's very flexible. Now, there is a lot of detail in one of these kits, lots of panels, all kind of features. So other than having the right kind of wash, the most important thing you're going to need to have is patience. If you feel it's getting on top of you and you are starting to just slap the paint on, you really need to stop. Patience is key here, because then you will get the brightest possible finish with the best contrast between the lighter areas and the carefully controlled shaded areas. Now, it's best to wait until the next day to allow the wash to dry completely, because it can be reactivated by water. That's one of the reasons why it's so good as a pin wash. You do have to give it a little bit of time to dry, and then the next day we can start highlighting. I break my highlighting down into 3 stages. This first, what I call the edge highlighting, where I use my brush to bounce along edges. As you can see here, I'm not painting a solid line along edges, I'm bouncing it along the edges, and these are what I call open edges that are easy to access. The next stage are the closed edges, where it's inside a panel where you maybe have to approach it from the top rather from the side, and then all the little bits of detail, little bolts, little catches, all these kind of things. And then the final stage is chipping, and I use that as part of the highlighting process because we're using a brighter colour in the main. The colour I'm using for the highlighting here is green grey. It's a desaturated colour, but one that gives a very clear highlight, which is what we're after, because that's going to give us a shape we need. But I'm not using, for instance, a bright green against a darker green background, because then, you know, like we're lifting up the colour as opposed to bringing out the edge, and that's what we want to do here. We're going to have darker recessed areas and brighter, sharper raised areas. For the initial edge highlighting stage, I'm going to use a brush which is a little bit past its best, so it's still sort of holding it together, and it's good for hitting edges, but it's not going to be used for any fine detail work anymore, because this kind of work can wear your brushes out really quite quickly. When you're working these edges, make sure that the brush is just damp enough so that the paint will flow off nicely, and just catch the edge nicely. If it's too wet, it's going to settle on the edge, and that's not what we're after. We're after a sharp line. If it's too dry, it's going to drag along the edge, and it's going to be rough, and it's not really going to look what we're after at all, folks. We're after a highlight here, not a dry brush. It's very important. If you end up feeling as though you're dry brushing the edges, then your paint is too dry. And once again, patience is key here, folks. As you can see, there's a lot to cover here, and especially on this kind of tank. Certain tanks are really easy to edge highlight. Something like this, with all these little bits of equipment, all the ERA panels and so on, that is going to be something that requires a lot of concentration. So if you feel as though it's getting on top of you, have a little break, come back to it. Because if you just keep going on quicker and quicker and quicker to get the job done, the chances are it's going to look over highlighted. Next stage, we're going to pick out internal panel lines, bolts, hinges, ridges, all these little areas that we couldn't just catch with an edge highlight. It's very important, once again, that the consistency of the paint is correct at this point, because you want to be putting on, especially on long internal panel lines for instance, a long, straight, solid edge. Something that isn't too thick, isn't too wide, it's got to be thin. And if you get your paint consistency right, then you'll manage it. If there's any problems again, once again, the brush will start to drag, the paint will drag off it, or the paint will settle if it's too wet, and once again, that's not what we're after. Then we can move on to chipping. Now for me, chipping is just an extension of the highlighting process. I use it to help accentuate edges, because remember, we're typically using a light colour, so the highlighting process will lead to the chipping process, light edges against a darker background. And I also use it to break up panels, so that certain panels will have a better focus because there's a little bit of internal detail on them, and it just helps create the overall weathered look. So once again, make sure your brush is got the right consistency of paint and water, it's got the right mix, so you're going to have nice controlled lines. I'll be using the highlighting that's already on there as a starting point, especially on panels. You know, you can work edges of the panels a bit more by painting a little bit more of that highlight colour in there and in a regular way, so it looks like the paint has chipped. And then you can put scratches, and these scratches go across panels or from the edges to the internal areas. Now, as before, patience is very important here, as is restraint, because it's very easy to do far too much chipping, far too much scratching, and you end up with something that is just completely out of balance and perhaps looks as though it should be in a scrapyard rather than in the front line. Now, you might see lots of really attractive 1/35 scale kits that look like that. Go that way if you want, but you find it tricky to get the right balance, and it'll become more of a painting exercise than you thinking about the end product. And you'll be glad to see we're now on to the final stage of chipping, which is going to be the dark exposed metal at the core of these small chips. Now I'm using a very fine brush here, so it's likely to dry out very quickly. All brushes that are small will dry quick as you use them, folks, so make sure you're refreshing it to get the right consistency. And I'm just placing a little bit of German Camo black brown at the heart of the chips and the scratches to show exposed metal that has been slightly rusted and weathered down. You can also use dark rust for this because we're working in very small areas, so it'll look very similar to the dark brown. But just be careful once again that you're not overdoing it. You don't have to apply this to the centre of every single scratch. It gives a bit of variety and gets a more weathered surface if you can keep that variety. Now let's pay some attention to these explosive reactive armour panels. They're a very prominent feature of this tank. So what I'm going to do here is try to get it looking a bit less samey, a bit less uniform, making it a bit more of a mosaic, and I'm going to do that using glazes. I'm going to use some medium olive, some dark rust and some green grey, and I'm just going to carefully apply these to the panels in a random way, but not in a completely dominating way. We still want to keep the overall background colour being similar to the rest of the tank. Imagine these panels have been placed on the tank and then they may have been sourced in different ways, different places, may have been replaced at some point, but there'll be some wear, but the general overall colour will be the same. So it's just working with glazes here, folks, making them thinner or thicker as required, so you might have to come back to a certain panel to rework it. So just let it dry, have a look, think about it and decide if you're happy. And it's time to do some more edge highlighting. I know you think I'm crazy, folks, but it's really going to help make these panels pop if we now go back over the edges, where we've been working the panels a bit, and that'll really help settle the shape in there, get the depth in there and the variety across the different tones that we've added. Next I've added just a couple of other colours that we're going to need, such as for the MG and the side skirts, and for the straps I want to make them slightly different colour using olive green here, medium olive on the straps, just to make them stand out a bit from the barrels. And there's very little other colour required on this, to be honest. So here on one of the barrels I am just putting a glaze of a medium kind of rust colour over it, just to try to make it stand out a little from the background. And you can do that across other areas of the vehicle as well if you want, using these little glazes to create a little bit of definition between the different areas, which will add to the shape without requiring complex airbrushing. Now I painted the side skirts there, the exposed skirts beside the ERA panels, with German grey, and I'm now creating a dusty look to them, a streaky look using light mud. You've got to work quick here, folks. You can add paint retardant to this or glazed medium, and that'll give you more time to work, and we just want to work it a bit so that we're going to get a dusty streaky finish. Exposed headlamps, searchlights, vision blocks, all these kind of things, I'm just painting them with a little blob of medium blue with a little highlight of something sharp in the corner, such as deck tan, for a nice simple glass-like finish. The unditching log is a nice simple paint job here, folks. You don't have to worry too much about these things. They were added at the factory, so they're finished pieces of wood. They don't have any kind of lacquer on them, but they're nicely rounded, featureless little bits of wood. So a little coat of old wood with a wash of German Camo black brown, that's really all we need to do here. Now on to some pigment work for the lower and upper hull of the tank. Now you've got to be careful with pigments, folks. It's very easy to put on too much. Don't put it on dry onto the kit and then try to work it like you might see on tutorials for 1/35 scale kits. They're a completely different prospect. Work it on a palette, and then when you've got the consistency you need, experience will tell you what that is. You can then apply it, let it dry, see how it looks, and then go back and either add more or take some off. Now the lower hull was easy, the upper hull is a bit more tricky. We really need to control what we're doing on the upper hull. Now you see I've got my palette with my lighter dust, darker for the lower, lighter for the upper because that's more likely to be dried, and I'm adding just little bits of water here folks. As you can see, I'm not really going mad here because I want to control what's going on to the upper hull to a much greater degree. I'm going to use a fairly small brush for this so it doesn't hold too much pigment and too much water, and then start applying it where I want it to look dusty, earthy, kind of dusty, rather than the dust that's on the rubber side panels. So just very carefully work through. As I said, don't put too much on. We can always add more. It's hard to remove what's there if you do it to excess, especially if you go over the top. It's a bit like cooking folks. If you add too much salt, you're kind of screwed, but if you've not added enough salt, you can always add a little bit more. But don't get confused and add salt to your figure folks. That's just a figure of speech. Though you can use salt for chipping. That might be something that you've heard of, maybe not, but if you make your tank wet and pour salt over it in a careful way, the salt will stick, and then you can spray paint over the top of it and then wash the salt off and you get chips. Not chips that you eat though. I'm getting everyone confused here, I can tell. But what not to get confused about folks is patience and scale. I've let it dry, it doesn't take long, and then you get an idea of what the finished appearance is because you can't really tell when it's wet. So I can decide if I need to remove some or if I need to add a little bit more to the areas that I've worked, or perhaps to some other areas that I have missed. You'll note I'm only really working the areas around the fenders at the front and at the back. You could put this all over the kit, you know, but once again, balance and scale is the important thing. You don't go over the top. It can be used to really help define the shape, especially if you're using a lighter dust on a darker figure. I've not used any on the turret, but there's some areas of the turret that might benefit from a bit of dust, but that's really tricky folks, and you've got to be really careful. And remember, we're doing wargame kits here. We don't need to kill ourselves to get them finished. And then when it's dried again, I'm going to take one last opportunity to have another look. My main focus is the areas where I've put it. Is it strong enough? Is it too weak? Does it need adjusting? I'm not so much looking for other areas where I can add it to here folks. That's something that you will be tempted to do because you're using pigments and maybe you're not familiar with it and it feels great and it looks great, but just make sure balance and scale don't go over the top. And once that's dried, we are ready for matte varnish. We're ready to finish. Now, important point to note is that matte varnish will reactivate the pigment. You cannot brush varnish over the top of pigment that has been applied by water. You can only spray it on. There are other ways of fixing pigment, but I'm not going to cover that. There are plenty of videos out there that will do that for you. The varnish will soften the pigment to a degree. That's why you've got to get the right balance of having just enough and not too much on there. If you put just a little tiny bit of pigment and then varnish it, your chances are you're not going to see the pigment. Bit of experience is required here folks. And that folks is us done. I've got some slides, some stills coming up at the end if you want to see some pictures of the finished tanks. But thank you for your time. Thanks for watching. I hope you found it useful. If you did and you'd like to see some more, don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell button, and that means we'll definitely see you all on the next one.